This detailed archival documentation captures a high-stakes legislative confrontation between Senator Brian Schatz and Brendan Carr, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, regarding the extent of federal reach into broadcast governance. The primary friction point emerges from a fundamental disagreement over whether the FCC possesses the legal standing to scrutinize or penalize stations for disseminating political satire or controversial comedic performances. Senator Schatz articulated a profound apprehension that focusing regulatory pressure on figures like Jimmy Kimmel represents an overreach of federal mandates and poses a direct risk to protected expression. In a sharp rebuttal, Chairman Carr maintained the position that every broadcast licensee is bound by the public interest standard as a prerequisite for utilizing the nation's electromagnetic spectrum. While Carr stopped short of issuing explicit ultimatums regarding the immediate cancellation of specific licenses, he insisted that regulatory oversight remains a non-negotiable legal obligation that the Commission is duty-bound to uphold. This discourse underscores the intensifying national debate concerning the precarious boundary between administrative supervision and the preservation of provocative media discourse in a free society. The friction witnessed in this exchange is not merely a bureaucratic disagreement but a deep-seated philosophical divide over the First Amendment's application to modern broadcasting. Senator Schatz argued that the moment the government begins to weigh the merits of a joke, the foundation of a free press begins to crumble under the weight of potential censorship. He posited that the subjective nature of humor makes it an inappropriate target for federal investigators who are tasked with objective technical and administrative oversight. By specifically referencing the scrutiny of late-night hosts, Schatz highlighted what he views as a dangerous precedent where political distaste is masked as regulatory necessity. This maneuver, according to the senator, serves to chill the creative environment and forces broadcasters to self-censor to avoid the looming shadow of federal litigation. The tension in the room was palpable as he demanded clarity on where the Commission draws the line between legitimate public interest and the suppression of dissenting or mocking voices. Chairman Carr, however, framed the issue through the lens of statutory responsibility and the historical precedents that govern the privilege of broadcasting. He reminded the committee that the airwaves are a finite public resource, and those granted the right to use them must operate within certain behavioral parameters. His stance suggested that the public interest is a dynamic concept that requires constant vigilance to ensure that the airwaves do not become a vehicle for societal harm. While he acknowledged the importance of artistic freedom, Carr emphasized that no broadcaster holds an absolute, unfettered right to ignore the standards set forth by congressional mandates. The dialogue revealed a complex layer of legal interpretation where the definition of indecency or public harm is often left to the discretion of those in power. This ambiguity is precisely what Schatz feared, as it allows for a flexible interpretation that could be weaponized against political adversaries under the guise of protecting the common good. The broader implications of this debate extend far beyond the immediate fate of a few comedic segments or individual television personalities. It touches upon the very essence of how a democratic society manages the flow of information and the degree to which it tolerates discomforting content. If the FCC is allowed to investigate the intent behind political satire, it opens a door to a more intrusive form of governance that monitors the cultural heartbeat of the nation. Schatz's line of questioning sought to expose the inherent bias that can creep into such investigations when they are triggered by political sensitivities. On the other hand, the Commission's defense rests on the idea that without some level of accountability, the quality and integrity of public broadcasting would inevitably deteriorate. This clash highlights a cyclical struggle in American politics where the desire for order and decency often runs headlong into the messy, irreverent nature of free speech. As the testimony progressed, the focus shifted to the specific mechanisms through which the FCC exerts its influence over local and national broadcasters. Carr's refusal to back down from the necessity of oversight suggested a firm belief in the institutional power of the Commission to act as a gatekeeper. This role, historically established to prevent signal interference and ensure localism, is now being tested in an era where content is increasingly polarized. The mention of specific performers like Kimmel served as a lightning rod for a much larger discussion about the cultural wars currently dividing the American electorate. For Schatz, these performers represent the front lines of a cultural defense against government overreach, whereas for critics of the current media landscape, they represent a decline in the standards of public discourse. This fundamental disagreement ensures that the role of the FCC will remain a central point of contention in the halls of Congress for years to come. Ultimately, the transcript reveals a government struggling to define its role in an age where the lines between entertainment and political commentary have become indistinguishable. The aggressive tone of the inquiry reflected a growing skepticism towards centralized authority and its potential to stifle the very freedoms it is meant to protect. Carr's defense of the regulatory framework was a reminder of the legal structures that have governed American media for nearly a century, even as those structures face unprecedented challenges. The debate serves as a critical case study in the tension between the administrative state and the individual's right to challenge that state through humor and critique. As the hearing concluded, it became clear that the resolution of this conflict would require more than just a clarification of rules, but a renewed consensus on the value of speech. The standoff between the senator and the chairman remains a potent symbol of a nation grappling with its own identity in the digital and broadcast age. The historical framework of American broadcasting has long been predicated on the notion that the airwaves are a scarce public commodity belonging to the citizens rather than the corporations that utilize them. This foundational principle was at the heart of the debate between the senator and the chairman as they parsed the nuances of the 1934 Communications Act. Senator Schatz questioned whether the current interpretation of this act has been stretched beyond its original intent to serve as a tool for political intimidation. He pointed out that the evolution of the public interest standard was never meant to empower a small group of unelected officials to act as the nation's moral arbiters. The senator's argument rested on the belief that the First Amendment provides a robust shield for even the most biting and offensive forms of political commentary. By bringing the Commission's investigative powers into question, he sought to reaffirm the boundary that prevents the state from dictating the acceptable limits of satire. Chairman Carr's defense of the agency's actions relied heavily on the established legal doctrine that broadcast speech enjoys less constitutional protection than print or digital media. This distinction, often traced back to landmark cases like FCC v. Pacifica Foundation, allows the government to regulate content that might be considered indecent or harmful to children. Carr argued that the Commission has a statutory duty to respond to complaints from the public regarding the conduct of its licensees. In his view, ignoring these complaints would constitute a dereliction of duty and undermine the regulatory integrity of the FCC. He maintained that the process of inquiry is a standard administrative procedure designed to ensure transparency and accountability within the industry. This perspective views the Commission not as a censor, but as a necessary referee in a crowded and often chaotic media marketplace. The specific focus on late-night comedy and satire introduces a significant complication into the traditional regulatory model used by the federal government. Satire, by its very nature, is designed to be provocative and often tests the boundaries of what is considered polite or acceptable discourse. Schatz argued that if the FCC begins to penalize stations for content that is clearly intended as humor, it creates a chilling effect across the entire industry. This atmosphere of fear could lead to the homogenization of broadcast content, where only the most sanitized and uncontroversial opinions are allowed to reach the public. The senator emphasized that the strength of American democracy lies in its ability to withstand and even embrace the mockery of its institutions. He warned that using the power of the license renewal process to influence content is a subtle but effective way of stifling political dissent. In response, the chairman pointed to the fact that the Commission's oversight is often reactive, triggered by the concerns of the viewing public rather than a top-down agenda. He argued that the FCC must have the ability to investigate whether a broadcaster is still serving the public interest, convenience, and necessity. This three-pronged test is the legal cornerstone of the Commission's authority and has been used for decades to justify various forms of intervention. Carr suggested that the investigation of controversial content is simply one aspect of a broader mandate to ensure that the airwaves are used responsibly. He denied that these actions were politically motivated, instead framing them as a routine exercise of administrative law. However, the timing and targets of these inquiries remain a point of intense skepticism for those who fear the politicization of the agency. The debate also touched on the shifting landscape of media consumption and how it challenges traditional regulatory definitions in the 21st century. As more viewers move towards streaming platforms that are not subject to the same FCC rules, the scrutiny on traditional broadcasters feels increasingly targeted. Schatz pointed out the inherent unfairness of a system where a joke told on a broadcast network could lead to a federal investigation, while the same joke on a cable channel goes unregulated. This disparity highlights the obsolescence of some of the Commission's core justifications, such as the pervasiveness and scarcity of the airwaves. The senator's line of reasoning suggested that the FCC is clinging to an outdated model to maintain control over a medium that is losing its dominance. This power struggle reflects a broader anxiety within the government about its ability to influence the national narrative in a fragmented media environment. Furthermore, the discussion delved into the specific language used by the Commission when communicating with broadcasters about their content and licensing status. Schatz was particularly concerned with the use of soft power, hints and suggestions that imply a license might be in jeopardy if certain changes are not made. This type of informal pressure is often more effective than formal sanctions because it avoids the public outcry and legal challenges associated with direct censorship. Carr defended the Commission's right to communicate with its licensees, asserting that clear guidance is necessary for compliance with federal law. He argued that broadcasters should welcome clarity on what is expected of them under the public interest standard. Yet, for many observers, this guidance looks remarkably like a roadmap for avoiding political conflict with the administration in power. The ideological divide between Schatz and Carr is emblematic of the current struggle to define the role of independent agencies in a polarized political climate. The FCC, which is intended to be a nonpartisan body, is increasingly seen as a battlefield for competing visions of the First Amendment. The senator's defense of Kimmel and other satirists is a defense of the marketplace of ideas where the public, not the government, decides what is valuable. The chairman's stance reflects a more paternalistic view of the state's role in safeguarding the moral and social fabric of the country. This clash of values ensures that every action taken by the Commission will be scrutinized for signs of bias or overreach. The transcript of their exchange serves as a vital record of this ongoing conflict and the high stakes involved for the future of American media. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, the focus remained on the delicate balance between liberty and order in the regulation of the airwaves. The questions raised by Senator Schatz challenged the very legitimacy of using federal power to monitor the creative output of the nation's broadcasters. Meanwhile, Chairman Carr's insistence on the necessity of oversight served as a reminder of the enduring power of the administrative state. The tension between these two perspectives is a permanent feature of the American legal landscape, reflecting a deeper uncertainty about the limits of government authority. The resolution of these issues will likely depend on future court rulings and the evolving public perception of what constitutes the public interest. For now, The debate continues to highlight the precarious position of those who use the airwaves to challenge the status quo. The dialogue between Senator Schatz and Chairman Carr escalated significantly as the focus shifted toward the concrete repercussions of the Commission's recent aggressive posture. A central point of contention was the temporary suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's late-night program following high-level administrative pressure and public condemnations from the FCC leadership. Senator Schatz characterized this event as a watershed moment in the history of American media, where regulatory rhetoric was successfully used to coerce a private corporation into silencing a prominent critic. He argued that the mere existence of an investigation into a comedic monologue suggests that the government has abandoned its role as a neutral arbiter of spectrum efficiency. By questioning Carr's personal involvement in the public discourse surrounding Kimmel, the senator sought to expose what he viewed as a coordinated effort to intimidate broadcasters. This line of inquiry emphasized that the actual revocation of a license is not necessary to achieve censorship. The threat alone is often sufficient to force corporate compliance. Chairman Carr's justification for his public statements relied on the theory that the FCC has a responsibility to set a moral and civic tone for the broadcast industry. He contended that when a performer uses the public airwaves to disseminate what he categorized as harmful misinformation or socially corrosive content, it falls within the Commission's purview to comment. Carr maintained that his remarks were not a direct order to ABC or Disney, but rather a reflection of the agency's commitment to the public interest standard. He argued that broadcasters must be held accountable for the impact of their programming on the national fabric, especially during times of heightened social tension. This perspective posits the FCC as a guardian of societal values, a role that goes far beyond the technical management of radio frequencies. However, Schatz countered that this guardianship is indistinguishable from the very authoritarian tendencies that the First Amendment was designed to prevent. The debate then moved into the technical weeds of the news distortion and broadcast hoax rules, which have historically been applied with extreme caution. Schatz challenged the chairman to explain how a satirical monologue could possibly be investigated under rules intended to prevent the deliberate falsification of news reports. He pointed out that if the Commission begins to classify satire as distortion, then no political commentary is safe from federal scrutiny. This expansion of definitions represents a significant shift in regulatory policy, moving from the objective measurement of facts to the subjective evaluation of intent and humor. The senator warned that this path leads to a government-curated media landscape where only approved forms of irony are tolerated. He suggested that the Commission's current trajectory is a direct threat to the creative spirit that has defined American television for generations. In response, Carr emphasized the uniqueness of the broadcast medium, noting that its pervasiveness and accessibility to children justify a higher level of scrutiny than other forms of media. He argued that the legal distinction between a private podcast and a broadcast television station is clear and well established in constitutional law. From his perspective, the hoax rule is a vital tool for ensuring that the public can trust the information transmitted through their television sets. He asserted that if a broadcaster allows its platform to be used for the dissemination of patently false information under the guise of entertainment, the FCC has a mandate to intervene. This argument attempts to bridge the gap between technical oversight and content regulation by framing the latter as a subset of public safety. Nevertheless, the lack of a clear boundary between falsehood and satire remains the most troubling aspect of this regulatory philosophy for civil libertarians. The hearing also highlighted the role of corporate risk aversion in the face of federal pressure, as seen in Disney's decision to pull Kimmel off the air temporarily. Schatz lamented that large media conglomerates are often more concerned with protecting their varied business interests and broadcast licenses than with defending the free speech rights of their employees. He argued that the FCC under Carr's leadership has exploited this vulnerability to bypass formal legal challenges and achieve immediate results. This governance by press release allows the Commission to influence content without ever having to defend its actions in a court of law. By creating an environment where the costs of litigation and regulatory delay are too high, the agency can effectively shape the media environment through suggestion and shadowboxing. The Senator's critique was a stark reminder that the protection of the First Amendment is only as strong as the willingness of institutions to stand up to executive pressure. Furthermore, the discussion delved into the broader implications of the FCC's recent investigations into major networks like ABC, CBS, and NBC News. Carr defended these inquiries as necessary responses to public complaints about bias and the lack of diverse perspectives in national reporting. He argued that the public interest is best served when the media provides a balanced view of the world, echoing the spirit, if not the letter, of the defunct fairness doctrine. Schatz, however, viewed these investigations as a thin veil for political retribution against outlets that have been critical of the current administration. He noted that the sudden surge in regulatory activity coincides perfectly with political grievances expressed by the White House, casting a long shadow over the agency's independence. This perceived alignment between the regulator and the executive branch is, in Schatz's view, a fundamental betrayal of the FCC's mission as an independent commission. The ideological clash reached a fever pitch when the Senator asked Carr directly if he believed the FCC had jurisdiction over the artistic choices of comedians. Carr's response, while nuanced, suggested that any content appearing on a broadcast station must ultimately satisfy the public interest requirement. This refusal to grant an explicit exemption for comedy signaled a new era of regulatory assertiveness that could fundamentally change the nature of late-night television. For Schatz, this was a clear admission that the Commission is prepared to act as a board of censors for political humor. He argued that the chairman's vision of the FCC would turn the agency into a tool for cultural engineering rather than a facilitator of communication. The standoff highlighted the deep-seated fears of a government that uses its power to flatten the diversity of the American cultural experience. As Part 3 of this transcript analysis concludes, it is evident that the battle over the airwaves is no longer about technical standards, but about the very soul of the First Amendment in the digital age. The exchange between Schatz and Carr serves as a warning that the institutions meant to protect the public can be repurposed to limit the public's access to challenging or dissenting ideas. The Kimmel incident stands as a potent example of how the administrative state can project its influence through a combination of legal authority and political theater. The resolution of this debate will determine whether the airwaves remain a vibrant, if sometimes messy, forum for free expression, or if they become a strictly regulated space for government-sanctioned discourse. The stakes for the future of American democracy and the freedom of the press could not be higher as these two visions of governance continue to collide. The escalating confrontation between Senator Schatz and Chairman Carr reached a critical juncture when the discussion turned to the actual casualties of this regulatory atmosphere, the silencing of late-night institutions. Schatz pointed to the cancellation of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert by CBS and the indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel Live by ABC as evidence of a systemic purge. He argued that these were not isolated business decisions but rather the direct result of regulatory bullying that leveraged the FCC's licensing power to achieve political ends. The senator noted that the timing of these cancellations, coinciding with high-stakes corporate mergers and intense administrative scrutiny, suggested a quid pro quo where free speech was sacrificed for regulatory approval. By articulating this, Schatz highlighted a disturbing trend where the government no longer needs to pass laws to censor. It simply needs to signal its displeasure to vulnerable parent companies. Chairman Carr defended these developments by reframing the narrative around the market-driven nature of the broadcast industry and the necessity of maintaining community standards. He asserted that if a network chooses to cancel a program, it is an exercise of their own editorial discretion, not a result of government coercion. However, Carr simultaneously doubled down on the idea that national programmers have an obligation to provide content that serves the entirety of the American public, rather than just a specific political demographic. He suggested that the toxic nature of some political satire had alienated large segments of the audience, leading to the financial instability that networks cited as the reason for cancellation. From Carr's perspective, the FCC is merely encouraging a return to a more balanced and respectful use of the airwaves. This defense, however, ignored the reality that the balance being sought appeared to lean heavily in favor of the current administration's sensitivities. The debate then moved to the legislative efforts being mounted to curb the FCC's perceived overreach, specifically the Broadcast Freedom and Independence Act. Senator Schatz argued that the current crisis has exposed a fatal flaw in the 1934 Communications Act. The public interest standard is too vague and too easily weaponized by whoever holds the chairmanship. He posited that without clear statutory limits on the Commission's ability to investigate content, the First Amendment remains at the mercy of bureaucratic whim. The proposed legislation seeks to explicitly bar the FCC from using viewpoint-based criteria in license renewal or merger reviews. Schatz emphasized that the goal is to restore the agency to its original purpose as a technical and administrative body, rather than a cultural police force. This legislative push represents a direct challenge to the paternalistic model of regulation that Carr has championed during his tenure. In his rebuttal, Carr argued that such legislation would neuter the Commission and leave the public defenseless against the most egregious abuses of the airwaves. He maintained that the power to revoke a license is the only real tool the FCC has to ensure that broadcasters remain faithful to their public obligations. Without the threat of meaningful sanctions, Carr suggested that networks would become unaccountable fiefdoms that could ignore local needs and disseminate misinformation with impunity. He framed his opposition to the bill as a defense of the little guy, the local viewer who relies on the government to ensure that their airwaves are not hijacked by national interests. This populist framing attempted to position the Commission as a shield for the public, even as critics argued it was being used as a sword for the executive branch. The discussion also touched upon the historical precedent of the Smothers Brothers cancellation in the late 1960s, drawing chilling parallels to the present day. Schatz reminded the committee that even then, it was not the law but the pressure of the executive branch and the fear of the FCC that led to the silencing of dissenting voices. He argued that we are witnessing a digital age redux of those tactics, where the tools of intimidation have become more sophisticated but the intent remains the same. The senator noted that when the state targets satirists, it is usually a sign that it cannot withstand the truth that humor often reveals. By invoking this history, Schatz sought to place the current struggle within a larger American tradition of resisting government-sanctioned orthodoxy. The legacy of those who fought for the right to be irreverent on television hangs over this debate like a solemn reminder of what is at stake. Furthermore, the inquiry delved into the role of voluntary preemption by local affiliates, a tactic Carr has publicly encouraged. Schatz characterized this as a form of decentralized censorship, where local stations are pressured to pull national content that might be deemed controversial by the Commission. Carr defended this practice as an exercise of localism, arguing that it is the right and duty of local broadcasters to tailor their programming to the specific values of their communities. However, Schatz pointed out that when this localism is triggered by federal threats, it is no longer a choice but a mandate. He warned that this approach would lead to a fractured media landscape where viewers in different parts of the country are exposed to vastly different versions of reality. This, he argued, is the antithesis of the public interest and serves only to deepen the nation's political divisions. The financial and psychological impact on the creative community was also a major theme in the senator's line of questioning. Schatz lamented that writers, producers, and performers are now working in a climate of fear, where a single controversial joke could jeopardize an entire network's business strategy. This self-censorship is often invisible but arguably more damaging than any formal government ban, as it preemptively narrows the scope of public discourse. Carr dismissed these concerns as theatrical, suggesting that true talent will always find a way to express itself within the bounds of decency. He argued that the creative community should focus more on producing content that unites the country rather than dividing it. This fundamental disagreement over the purpose of art, whether it should serve as a mirror to society or a tool for social cohesion, remains the core of the conflict. As Part 4 concludes, the battle lines are clearly drawn between a vision of the FCC as a neutral technical administrator and a vision of the agency as a moral and political gatekeeper. The suspension of Kimmel and the cancellation of Colbert are not just footnotes in media history. They are the opening volleys in a war over the future of the First Amendment. The legislative battle for the Broadcast Freedom and Independence Act will likely be the ultimate test of whether the American system can self-correct against the lure of administrative authoritarianism. Schatz and Carr represent two irreconcilable philosophies of governance, leaving the public to wonder if the public interest still includes the right to laugh at those in power. The tension remains unresolved, with the fate of the airwaves, and the voices they carry, hanging in a precarious balance. The concluding phase of the legislative inquiry focused heavily on the inevitability of a Supreme Court intervention to resolve the constitutional impasse created by the Commission's recent maneuvers. Senator Schatz posited that the current interpretation of the public interest standard, as wielded by Chairman Carr, has essentially created a collision course with modern First Amendment jurisprudence. He argued that the era of broadcast exceptionalism, the legal idea that television and radio deserve less protection than other media, is a relic of a technologically primitive age. Schatz pointed out that in a world of infinite content streams, the government's justification for monitoring a comedian's monologue on the basis of spectrum scarcity is no longer legally or logically defenseless. He suggested that the FCC's recent actions have effectively invited the judiciary to strip the agency of its content-related powers once and for all. This long-term strategic view shifts the debate from a political skirmish to a fundamental restructuring of federal administrative authority. Chairman Carr, remaining steadfast, argued that the Supreme Court has historically affirmed the unique responsibilities of broadcasters precisely because of their profound impact on the domestic social fabric. He maintained that the public interest is not a static concept, but a living obligation that must be adapted to meet the challenges of each generation. Carr suggested that if the courts were to eliminate the FCC's oversight, the result would not be more freedom, but a lawless media environment where corporate interests are entirely untethered from civic responsibility. He framed the potential for judicial review not as a threat, but as an opportunity to reaffirm the state's legitimate role in safeguarding the quality of public discourse. This perspective views the Commission as a necessary moral anchor in a society increasingly fragmented by digital echo chambers. However, Schatz countered that a government-imposed anchor is often just another name for a weight that drowns dissenting voices. The discussion then touched upon the revolutionary Broadcast Freedom and Independence Act of 2025, which seeks to codify the principle of viewpoint neutrality into the Communications Act. Senator Schatz emphasized that this bill is the only way to prevent the FCC from becoming a permanent weapon of the executive branch. He argued that by stripping the agency of the power to investigate distortion or incivility, Congress can return the Commission to its proper role as a neutral arbiter of technical standards. The senator noted that the widespread support for this bill, even among some of Carr's traditional allies, indicates a growing national consensus that the government has overstepped its bounds. This legislative movement represents a reclamation project for the First Amendment, aimed at ensuring that no future administration can use the licensing process to silence its critics. Schatz's final appeal was to the enduring American tradition of skeptical inquiry and the belief that the remedy for bad speech is more speech, not a federal investigation. In a poignant moment of the hearing, the focus returned to the individual creators, the writers, actors, and satirists, whose lives and careers are caught in the crossfire of this regulatory war. Senator Schatz lamented that the Kimmel precedent has already begun to change the way art is produced in the United States. He described a future where every script is vetted by lawyers not for libel or copyright, but for regulatory risk, leading to a sterilization of the American cultural experience. He argued that the true strength of a democracy is measured by its ability to tolerate mockery, and that a government that fears a joke is a government that has lost its way. Carr's response, while professional, remained focused on the accountability of these performers to the audience they serve. He suggested that the creative community has a social contract with the public that includes a baseline level of respect and truthfulness. This fundamental disagreement over whether art is a private right or a public service remains the unresolved core of the entire debate. Furthermore, the transcript captures a deep dive into the international implications of the FCC's current trajectory. Schatz warned that by expanding the definitions of harmful content and public interest, the United States is providing a blueprint for authoritarian regimes around the world to justify their own censorship. He argued that the FCC under Carr is undermining the moral authority of the US to advocate for global internet freedom and a free press. Carr dismissed this as a false equivalency, asserting that the American system of administrative law provides more than enough due process to prevent any slide into tyranny. He maintained that there is a clear distinction between the legitimate oversight of a democratic regulator and the arbitrary censorship of a totalitarian state. Yet, for many observers, the line between these two concepts has become dangerously blurred as the Commission continues to target specific political voices. As the hearing reached its final hour, both men offered their closing visions for the future of American communications. Senator Schatz envisioned a permissionless media landscape where the government's only role is to ensure that the signals are clear and the markets are competitive. He called for a total separation of state and content, arguing that the public is more than capable of deciding what to watch without the help of a federal commission. On the other hand, Chairman Carr envisioned a coordinated media ecosystem where the government, the public, and the broadcasters work together to maintain a healthy information environment. He argued that in an age of foreign interference and societal polarization, the state cannot afford to be a passive bystander. These two visions represent the polar extremes of American political thought, liberty versus order, and their collision is what will define the next decade of media law. The resolution of this conflict will likely not be found in the halls of Congress but in the quiet deliberations of the Supreme Court. Legal scholars expect that the Loper-Bright decision, which ended the era of judicial deference to federal agencies, will be the primary tool used to dismantle the FCC's content-based authorities. By requiring the agency to prove its statutory mandate in every investigation, the courts are likely to narrow the definition of public interest to its most technical and least intrusive form. This shift would represent a historic victory for broadcasters and a significant defeat for those who believe the state should have a say in the national conversation. Senator Schatz's persistent questioning of Carr served as a pre-litigation record, documenting the very abuses of power that will eventually be cited in the briefs filed before the highest court. The transcript is thus more than a record of a hearing. It is a roadmap for the legal challenges that lie ahead. Ultimately, the clash between Brian Schatz and Brendan Carr serves as a definitive snapshot of a nation in the midst of a profound identity crisis. The airwaves, once seen as a unifying public square, have become a contested territory where the definition of truth and humor is up for grabs. The outcome of this struggle will determine whether the United States remains a country where a comedian can challenge a president without fear of federal retribution. As the chairman's term continues and the legislative battles intensify, the public remains the ultimate judge of which vision for the future they prefer. The silence of a suspended show or the noise of a heated debate are both signals of a democracy that is still actively, and sometimes painfully, working through its core principles. The legacy of this exchange will be measured by the degree to which the airwaves remain open to all, regardless of the political winds of the day.